Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Well, hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the Executive Editor of Conservative Home, and joining me, of course, the man himself, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you very much.
How are you today?
Extremely well, and you?
Very well, thank
Good.
you, all things considered. I mean, always interesting times, and as ever, we record this on a Monday and it goes out on a Tuesday. And so, I'm going to ask you, how was Chequers yesterday?
Oh, it was a wonderful place to visit. It's a very fine house with many interesting curios inside it, including a life mask of Cromwell and a ring that belonged to Elizabeth I and is reputed to be the one that was sent to James I and VI to indicate that he had become the King of England. So it's a fascinating place to go.
And curios including the Prime Minister on this occasion?
Well, I think that's a harsh way of referring to the Prime Minister. I don't think she's a curio. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister.
And how was she?
She was in very good form. And it was an interesting meeting. But obviously the meeting was confidential, and though not everybody respects the confidentiality of meetings, I rather feel obliged to.
I'm sure our listeners would expect nothing less. I mean, in terms of whether you feel able to discuss anything about what your message to her might be at the moment, whether it was yesterday or today, obviously things change very, very, very swiftly. What's your message to Downing Street about how things currently stand?
Well, I think Downing Street has lost the opportunity to leave without a deal, and I think that was a mistake. That it seemed last week as if Downing Street was going to take that opportunity, and that would have been on the 29th of March, on Friday at 11 o'clock at night. That was all set. And it's now been pushed into the long grass. And why do I think that was an error? Well, the legal position was leaving. It was what people voted for, effectively. It was what the government was pretty clear would happen. The Prime Minister said, I think, 100 times or more from the dispatch box that we would leave on the 29th of March. So I think there's a feeling that political trust is not what it ought to be, that if the Prime Minister can say something, then it gets changed, not to a date that the Prime Minister asked for, but one that the EU insisted upon, then the system is not operating properly. So there are difficulties with that decision. I'm concerned that her deal is in no way a good deal, that the backstop is particularly problematic, but there are other problems with it. And against that, there are the threats of a long delay and many people in Parliament who want to frustrate the result of the referendum. So we're in a very difficult political situation.
And by the sound of it, you feel that one delay quite easily translates into further delays?
That's obviously a risk, isn't it? And I think the people who never wanted us to leave the European Union see delay as a route to preventing our departure.
In that circumstance, is it your view, there's a bit of legal debate going on at the moment, is it your view that actually this offer in itself by the EU, or the EU describes as a decision about delay, is actually now the law? And effectively, if the SI that's brought forward in the Commons, even if it fails, the EU would argue that delay is going to happen anyway.
It's a very interesting legal argument, which I'm not qualified to give a view. I know that lawyers are studying it very carefully. The government's view is that it can, under the royal prerogative, change the date, even though the date is set in statute without a statutory instrument for which there's provision to change it. This seems to me, as a layman, to be surprising, but the law doesn't necessarily work in the way that a layman would expect.
Which means that no deal, in that sense, moves from being a goal to a hope to becoming a kind of what was a wish.
The Prime Minister will not deliver a no-deal Brexit.
In that circumstance, the choice for Eurosceptics shifts, does it not, from deal or no deal to deal or potentially no Brexit?
That, I think, becomes the choice eventually. Whether we're there yet is another matter. But I've always thought that no deal is better than Mrs May's deal, but Mrs May's deal is better than not leaving at all. And so there is a sort of hierarchy of choice. If the choice is the one you suggest, then inevitably leaving the European Union, even leaving it inadequately and having work to do afterwards, is better than not leaving at all. And perhaps the thought processes that people like me hadn't gone through before is the thought that Brexit is a process rather than an event. And that I think many of us felt that 29th of March, we leave, that's it, bingo, done. Whereas it seems as if leaving is much the same as joining, that if you look back at when we joined in 1972, 1st January 1973, we joined a limited organisation with limited ambitions and a particular role in certain areas such as trade. And as our membership continued, it became more and more deeply embedded in our constitutional, legal and political systems until we were effectively part of a superstate. And perhaps unravelling that is not just a single event back to 1972, but is instead a process of unravelling and diverging which will take time.
So from ever closer union to ever greater independence.
Absolutely right. That's a very good way of putting it.
That takes quite a psychological, presents quite a psychological challenge, I would suggest, to some Eurosceptics who have hoped for the big moment of escape, who not unreasonably believe that a big moment of victory at the ballot box would lead to a big moment of implementation.
Indeed, and it could have been that way had the government decided to deliver it in that way. But the thing that has surprised me is the extraordinary degree of entrenched opposition to our leaving the European Union, and the fact that the House of Commons has a large majority that is against leaving the European Union. So you've got this disconnection between the British voters and the British Parliament, and that's unusual. It's constitutionally a risk, it's problematic, but it is unfortunately where we are, and therefore, from a Eurosceptic point of view of somebody in my position, as one of the minority of MPs who really wants to leave, we have to recognise that what we want and what we can deliver is not necessarily the same because of our lack of numbers. The ERG and other Eurosceptics in Parliament cannot win any vote on our own.
So there's a job of work to do within Euroscepticism now, within the kind of Leaver or Brexiteer community. Some listeners to this podcast and some of your colleagues in the ERG or elsewhere in the House of Commons would argue that this deal is worse than remaining. Some others would argue that actually if we just stick to our guns, then the 29th will come round and it will automatically happen anyway. Is there a process, is there a plan for that matter, to try to persuade them otherwise? Well,
let's discuss those two particular points. First of all, is this deal worse than not leaving? No, definitely not. If we take this deal, we are legally out of the European Union, and any proposal to rejoin would require us formally to adopt the euro and to join Schengen. And so being legally out is of great importance. It restores our independence. And then everything changes. As a member of the European Union, you are subject to EU law. EU law is superior law. As a country with a treaty obligation to the European Union, we are subject to international law, not to European law. International law is very different. It's much harder to enforce. It doesn't actually have a court that can deal with disagreements between international bodies and states. So there's no way you can go and get a judgment to say you shouldn't do this. And international law is in reality much more political than it is legal. So we move from being under a series of legal obligations that have direct effect to being under a series of political obligations that have legal wording surrounding them. And so I think it's a great error to think that remaining in the European Union is in any sense better than being legally out of it. Because if we're legally out of the EU and it tries to impose a regulation on us that we don't want, we simply say thank you so much, but no. If we are in the European Union and it passes a regulation by qualified majority vote that we don't want, we're caught by it. There is nothing we can do. That's the first point. The second point is just wait till the 29th of March, 11 o'clock in the evening, and we're out. I wish that were true, but it no longer is. And so what about the 12th of April? Well, if you can extend it once, you can extend it again. And the Prime Minister does not want to leave without a deal. And the Cabinet doesn't want to leave without a deal. And the British Parliament doesn't want to leave without a deal. It is therefore very, very difficult to see how you get to leaving without a deal, even though that is the law of the land.
And there's a danger implicit to that. I would suggest that some members of the ERG, some perfectly well-intentioned deep-seated, long-standing Eurosceptics and anti-EU MPs could continue to cast their votes in a way that Remainers are cheering, effectively. That actually they see as helping them to a route to undoing or avoiding Brexit entirely.
That is obviously a risk that we have to take on board, yes.
Is that a conversation you've had with any of them?
Well, I shouldn't go into private conversations, but you can look at who is in the same division lobby and who is cheering the government having lost the meaningful vote twice. And it's not just Eurosceptics, it's also some of the most pro-membership of the EU people who think it is their route to keeping us in the European Union.
I don't know if you've picked up this. I've certainly heard some mutterings about the possibility of these legal questions about the 29th and whether the EU, or indeed the government, can unilaterally decide on postponement. I've heard some mutterings that these things could be tested in the courts. This could be something that's brought to judicial review or similar. Is that something you've picked up on?
When there are legal mutterings, things can always be brought to the courts, but is there any specific plan to do that I'm aware of? No.
Understood. And in terms of the constitutional aspect of all of this, one of the things we've talked about before, and I know that you've talked about with Paul Goodman in other episodes of the Moggcast, is the way in which our constitution is being tested. In some ways being invigorated by this process, I would suggest, but in other ways being tested, whether it's the Speaker deciding to behave in somewhat inconsistent ways, whether it's cabinet ministers not following the three-line whip but retaining their job, the House of Lords overreaching, and so on and so on. Can a system of convention, a system of honour, effectively an honesty box constitution, can it survive if a circumstance in which people feel more strongly about winning than they do about honouring it?
If you look at our constitutional history, you see that it has had strains before, and that these strains come when there are big issues of this kind being debated. So, yes, historically it's been able to cope with these strains, but we are in extraordinary constitutional times, that we have a breakdown of collective responsibility, we have a breakdown of the relationship between the executive, the government, and the House of Commons, the legislature, and we have the House of Lords behaving in the way it did in the late 19th century, thinking that it is an equal partner to the House of Commons rather than a revising chamber with junior responsibilities. That is a real challenge for the Constitution, and I think the Constitution is as dysfunctional today as it has been at any point, probably since 1909 to 1911. And it was as dysfunctional then as it had been since 1832 with the Reform Bill going through. That there are these extraordinary tensions, and the overturning of precedent in the House of Commons, except when it's convenient, is a real challenge for how the House of Commons operates and for our own version of the separation of powers. The breakdown of collective responsibility makes effective government impossible, because who do you hold to account? You know, if one minister is saying X and the other is saying Y, what's government policy? What are you meant to question government ministers about in the House of Commons when you don't know and they'll say different things? So the system creaks and groans under the current strains. Will it survive this? Yes, probably, but it's very unfortunate that this is coinciding with a period of minority government, because minority government is something that our system doesn't work well with. Actually, if you look at the difficulties of government in the 19th century, a lot of that was because it was a stream of minority governments, no real control. And that is the most testing constitutional time.
And the end of the first decade of the 20th century, that crisis was no doubt sizable, but in part it focused on one particular aspect of the Constitution, namely the relationship between the powers and rights of the House of Lords in relation to the House of Commons. We have a quintuple, sextuple threat, or almost.
Yes, but in 1909 to 1911 you also had the issue of Home Rule for Ireland, which very much tied into it, because the Liberals didn't have a majority after 1910 without the support of the Irish. So you had the fundamental constitution of the country going alongside the House of Lords issue. So it was, I think, a broader constitutional crisis.
What we saw then was effectively there was a clarification. You could view it as a change or as a clarification of the relationship backed up by a sanction, effectively a threat to pack the House of Lords. Now, in terms of actual proposals for clarification or reform or change, the main one which goes around seems to be the Letwin plan, which itself is not a hugely coherent idea of the Commons somehow substituting itself for the executive in a partial, temporary or arbitrary way.
Well, I think all this is showing the absolute failure of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, because the Letwin plan would be impossible in a period prior to the Fixed Term Parliament Act. That the idea that the House of Commons can come up with a group that is not the government, which will pilot legislation through, is absurd. Nobody then knows what they're voting for at a general election. There is no accountability, but there's also no validity. Who will determine this? Who is going to be the sort of House of Commons' own Prime Minister in competition with the Prime Minister in Downing Street? Is it going to be the Speaker? Are we going to be like the United States House of Representatives, where the Speaker becomes a political figure in opposition sometimes and currently to the President?
And what form of sanction is there for anybody who is riding roughshod over one convention or precedent or even explicit rule or another?
Well, there's no sanction at all at the moment because the government is so weak.
Which means, but also the House of Commons is unwilling to enforce rules against its own desires, effectively.
Oh, what sort of sanctions do you mean? You mean if the government ignores the House of Commons? There's no...
If the government, if the Prime Minister is too weak, for example, to enforce collective responsibility on her cabinet, or the House of Commons is unwilling to compel the Speaker to abide in a consistent way by the concept of precedent, because ultimately enough members of the House of Commons feel that they're getting what they want.
Yes. Then
that becomes a rot, which is very hard to see how one can extract it once it really gets into the kind of beams of the Constitution.
I think the point at which we have an election where one party or another has a comfortable majority, it very quickly gets put right.
And in a sense that people start to give up that feeling of just doing what they like. Because
why were Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher such powerful prime ministers?
Because they had the votes.
Because they had huge majorities. And that makes all the difference. If you've got a big majority, you can have a huge rebellion and you still get your business through. And then everything revolves around the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's powers are then very considerable. Prime Ministers have very small majorities, don't have that authority because they can't be certain of getting their business through. And therefore we are in an unusual constitutional situation.
There's a lesson, of course, also that some of the roots of this crisis were laid in the Blair years,
yes.
Particularly in terms of simply disregarding convention. What appeared to be a seismic discovery in government that actually you could just choose not to do particular things, and as you say, as long as you had the votes, you could get away with doing so. Then you have the coalition laying in ground things like the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. What can we do to try and restore a sense of caveat when governments choose to act and they have the votes to do so, thinking about the impact when a future government might not have the votes?
Well, I think this has been a very useful and educational process, that people thought that Tony Blair's approach was the normal approach and that would work and that you didn't have to follow the conventions and that you could override them without thinking through what the consequences were. And people like me who are fascinated by the Constitution and think that it only works if people operate within the conventions and that the conventions have a force well beyond their legal force, would consider to be old-fashioned and not to understand how modern politics worked. Whereas I think we can say, look, it's an unpleasant thing to say to anybody, but we told you so. We said the Fixed Term Parliament Act wouldn't work because it goes against the grain of how the country is governed. We are saying in this current debate that the House of Commons thinking the government will not work because the House of Commons doesn't have the technical ability to be an executive, that breakdown of collective responsibility will not work. Why? Because you don't know who the government is and what it's supposed to be doing. So the historic conventions have been proved to be important and effective, and I think that becomes a reason for putting them back. but they're very hard to legislate for. You can't legislate for collective responsibility because if a government is weak and it doesn't have a majority, the Prime Minister can't fire senior ministers who don't abide by the government line.
Do you feel that sufficient of your colleagues on any side of the House really understand that, or are willing to self-deny, or do you fear that once they've got a taste for that's seen in A Man for All Seasons, where they talk about tearing down every law in England to get to the
Absolutely.
devil, where they get a taste for doing so, it could be quite a hard addiction to shake off.
Oh, it'll be shaken off once there's a majority. Just wait. If any party, Labour or Conservative, has a majority, the first thing they will do is take away all the residual powers of the Speaker. He will not be able to sneeze without the permission of a government minister. It will be a very severe response and rewrite of standing orders to stop what has happened in the last 4 months happening again. And it's a great shame because Speaker Bercow has been an excellent speaker, has very much improved the standing of the House of Commons against the executive until recently when he's gone too far. And I think that risks all the important reforms that he's made. I think you will find that standing orders are changed to limit urgent questions, to limit SA24 debates. Standing orders will be changed to entrench government's control of business. And all you need is a majority of 50, and all these standing order changes will go through in the blinking of an eye.
Does there come a point, potentially, if that process fails to happen, at which some really fundamental questions have now been asked about the viability of an uncodified constitution, about whether we ought to look at something that entrenches or codifies more strictly in a written sense?
No, it wouldn't make any difference. It's all to do with numbers. Look at the US with a codified constitution. It has great rows between its legislature and its executive, and its judiciary has become politicised. Indeed, people write learned articles about how the most important thing Donald Trump has done is to appoint a very large number of judges throughout the federal system to take control of the judicial system, not just for his period of office, but potentially for decades for the Republicans. So codifying it, formalising it, putting it in black letter law doesn't make any difference. These strains still emerge and have to be dealt with.
Thank you. I'm aware that time is flying by almost as fast as the MP for Peterborough trying to get home in time.
Why did the little boy throw his clock out of the window?
Why?
You want to see how time flew.
There you go. So to return from that discussion back to where we began, the occupant of Chequers at the weekend, if I had to press you to it, from your feeling, your experience, your gauge of the mood among your colleagues, how much longer does the Prime Minister have?
There is no system of formal challenge until November or December of next year, a year since the last challenge was made. A Prime Minister who is in office is not easy to remove. The Prime Minister might even win such challenge. She won it last time. So I think this is a matter for her.
As we were just discussing, always in the Constitution, there can be a difference, of course, between formal foundations and the informal erosion that happens around them. The sands of time are definitely trickling out, aren't they?
It's very difficult to know, and I think I'm the wrong person to answer because I was instrumental in the vote of no confidence last year, and I would not want to repeat that exercise. I lost, and I must recognise that I lost, and therefore I think the Prime Minister is entitled to my support whilst she wishes to remain Prime Minister. That's not to say that there aren't other factors around this that are not within either my or her control, but that I don't think I should be campaigning for her to stand aside at this point.
And typically honourable answer. Thank you very much, Jacob.
Thank you very much. No, it's a very kind of you to stand in for Paul.
And we shall return again with the Moggcast very soon.
When we may know where we are, or we may not.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.